Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction, and indeed for being here to share this with me this morning. As outlined, I have a wide range of interests. I'm from a psychology background, but I'm also interested in, perhaps arising from that, issues relating to scientific literacy, because people often question, as we will go on to see, the nature of psychology and whether it is best approached scientifically or in some other way. I won't keep you delayed by any introductions. Let me just sort of remind you of these kind of where we are in the world. I mean, I'm not purporting to summarize the history of academia in 2 slides, but it might be worth sort of at least reflecting on where we've come from and how we have changed. And this is a fairly famous painting. If I have the pointer here, perhaps I don't. Okay, this is a fairly famous painting of the university, and the main point to make, of course, is that the origin of this type of constellation of furniture stems from at least the 14th century, where the lecturer was the only person in the room who had the so-called book. And so it was a requirement that everybody arrive in and sit in a tiered theatre so they could hear the person read from the book and take their own notes. And one imagines that if people in the 14th century had mass production of literature, that perhaps we wouldn't have the types of lecture theatres that we have today. Of course, if you study the details of an image like this, you do begin to see some kind of similarities between the 14th century university and our own. You see the people up the back there chatting among themselves. This chap here obviously has been out late the night before. And we also, if you study carefully and speculate a little bit, we have a little bit of evidence of the mature students sitting up the front of the lecture hall. Anyway, so some things change and some things don't. Now, this is a dramatically simplified summary of how, for example...
I'll turn it back up when you're ready to go to it.
Okay. For example, how literacy has spread. And in the last century or so, colour images being what they are, you can get the impression, if you treat each physical geographical state as a data point, regardless of the size, you see that literacy has spread quite a lot around the world over the last century or so. And obviously there are lots of problems in the world, lots of problems with education access, but there has been a massive change in the last 100 years or so on the availability of knowledge, or at least the accessibility of knowledge through the emergence of literacy and mass literacy in many countries. It has been noted that scientific literacy has not kept pace with that growth. So regardless of how you measure it, it seems to be that scientific literacy is incorrigibly low in most countries. And this is data from the United States. It does show an increase across a 30-year period, but as recently as 2009, fewer than 30% of the adult population in the US were classified as scientifically literate when you apply the normal measurement techniques. And these are often short quizzes asking basic questions about things like radiation and the human body, and if people and the shape of the Earth and the position of the planets and things like that. And if people can answer a certain number of these questions, they fall below the threshold of scientific literacy. There are more than one way of dealing or defining scientific literacy, of course, and a lot of what I'm interested in and what others are interested in is in the thought processes of what constitutes the way knowledge is produced as much as what knowledge is. So we can observe that people have low scientific literacy when surveys tell us that lots of people think that houses can be haunted. That 4 out of 10 British adults, for example, think that houses can be haunted, or that astrology has some merit. Large numbers of the population persist in believing that the position of the planets at the point of your birth, or perhaps at all times, can influence affairs on Earth. And if you study this area, it's unsurprising that these data get confirmed on an ongoing basis. So even though we have this massive increase in literacy of a kind, we have perhaps the hint that this generates a sort of mass spread of misinformation as much as it spreads information. But the other type of scientific literacy is about where information comes from and what constitutes the process by which evidence for a proposition can be generated and considered. So for a simple example of that is the distinction between correlation and causation. And an ability to understand the distinction, or at least the non-overlap to an extent. Causation implies correlation, but correlation doesn't imply causation, things like that. That's a form of scientific literacy as well. It's not so much about the knowledge, it's about how knowledge is generated. And that type of literacy is also apparently low in the general population. So here's this paper from, or an article from the Daily Mail, warning of a casual link, apparently, between internet porn and rise in sex offences. And there are a number of problems with this, not least that the editing process on the science news section wasn't familiar enough with the term causal link to actually pick up on the error either in the headline or indeed throughout the body of the article, where the reporter consistently referred to this danger of a casual link. There you go. I've written a little bit about this on the blog aforementioned, as you can see there in the background. There are deeper problems with this, though, because the story being reported was that, it's a devilish proposition. Does pornography cause criminality, or does criminality cause pornography use? It's not something that is easily resolved in terms of causality, but the Daily Mail felt that it was because of a study that had been reported which involved interviewing one prisoner in a prison. And by doing that, they were able to establish a causal link, or as they call it, a casual link. Maybe that is a good term for it under the circumstances. So we're talking more about these types of issues when we talk about scientific literacy, really. I think it's plausible that people might not know what an atom is, but still would have a certain amount of scientific competence in terms of determining what is likely to be factual from what is likely to be rubbish. And that type of scientific literacy is very important as well. Now, we tend to call these types of things different terms, and one term that has emerged, and it's in the title of the presentation, so I thought I would put it up here, is woo. And this is a sort of a casual term, to use a recently used word, to describe these kind of flimsy beliefs or beliefs in the absence of evidence. And it includes things like esoteric attitudes towards, the ability to communicate with dead people and things. But it also includes things like, what is the cause of crime? Does increasing immigration always cause increase in crime? That's a pseudoscientific proposition, potentially, if it is believed in the absence of evidence, or if it is believed in the presence of flimsy evidence. So woo takes many shapes and forms. And it sometimes seems that it takes over the world. Another term that people commonly use is mumbo-jumbo. And people have often observed that we are really going down the tubes intellectually as a population, as a human race, because the world is becoming swamped with things like mumbo-jumbo. Now, how does that affect us, and in what ways does it do so? I'll give you an example. Here's a well-known commentator on empirical literacy. Sometimes, people do argue that scientific literacy is important for the democratic process. If people voting in elections have no competence to be able to distinguish between a flimsy argument and a strong argument, then public policy will take a certain course and will probably be driven more by expediency and electoral considerations rather than what might be the evidence in favour of it or against it. Famously in 2007, there was an increase in the discussion and the attention being paid to economic indicators and the likelihood of a housing crash and other things at that time. And many academics in studying these matters, both in terms of economics and in finance, had been issuing warnings and had been criticising government policy. And this contribution by people who study the areas to public debate was consistently dismissed by those in government over us, including the Taoiseach at the time, Bertie Ahern, who described them as people who are sitting on the sidelines cribbing and moaning. Now, there was an extension to that quotation, so I'll just play you a short clip. This is, in many ways, a kind of a memorable quotation. But remember, the context is he's describing these academic economists who have been criticising government policy.
Sitting sitting on the sidelines or on the fence.
Okay, let's go back. Let's go back. I'll get the volume up. There we go. Okay. It's worth the wait.
Sitting on the sidelines or on the fence, cribbing and moaning is a lost opportunity. In fact, I don't know how people who engage in that don't commit suicide.
Yes. Now, so this was the Prime Minister of the day, who subsequently is featured in advertisements for tabloid newspapers while appearing in someone's kitchen cupboard. That's the clip there. But at the day, he was. This was his attitude to academic input and scientific input into public policy formation. And it was criticised at the time largely around the insensitivity towards the matter of suicide. And that, of course, is highly appropriate. It was less criticised, in fact, I'm not sure it ever was criticised, on the basis of simply being closed-minded to alternative perspectives and to being dismissive of analytic approaches to policy formation. So it is something that affects us in various ways. Of course, we can't just blame Bertie and Bertie speak for that, because we all voted for him. So in the same year, there was a general election where he romped home and formed the next government and is a hugely popular leader. So it's a matter of public concern that we collectively as a population were, at that time at least, and possibly continue to be, willing to endorse a style of governance that was dismissive of logic and evidence and asking the question, what about the other side of the argument? All right. Recently, as last year, the law on emergency contraception in this country was changed, and this is an area that's of interest to me, and it's a huge research area. There's quite a lot of work all over the world of what would happen if you changed the law on the availability of emergency contraception. For example, if you wished to make it available to people without prescription, or if you wish to make it emergency contraception to be available to minors without knowledge of their parents. And in the United States, during the Bush administration, David Hager was consulted on this and was appointed the sort of czar on the matter. And this is a man who also writes books called As Jesus Cared for Women, and this was he was willing to put aside the evidence base in order to insist that policy remained the way it was at the time. Whereas in Ireland, and I've again written a short piece about this on the blog there, the law was changed simply because Boots wanted to sell it anyway. So they just sold it in the shops to anybody who wanted to buy it. And because they were such a large player in the market, the law was changed so that it wouldn't be seen to be breaking it. And it was as simple as that, actually. So you have this huge effort by academics and scientists and social scientists and others to shed light on these matters. And then you have policy being made in a way that is willing to just ignore that. And that's what I think is a problem that is of more concern than people believing in ghosts or such matters in large numbers. All right. Now, the internet comes into this, of course, because people often criticize the latest big thing as being implicated in the development of social problems. And in this sort of century, it has become the internet. So it used to be books. In fact, people in Victorian times were kind of accused of you shouldn't let your children read books. It would ruin their eyesight, would undermine their ability to develop social skills. It would destroy their imaginations and things. Later in that century, or later in the last century, it was television, and then it was colour television. People thought colour television was worse than black and white television and so on. Then it was video games. Now it's the internet. So just because social problems exist, obviously the latest thing must be responsible. And the internet is incredibly popular. This is Gapminder data. I just like the shape of the graph, really. But this is 1991 internet usage by country. Each data point represents a different country. Colour represents region. Size represents population. The axis left to right is literacy. So the more literate countries are on the right, the less on the left. And the height of the graph represents internet usage, and it's based on an algorithm. So basically, the higher, the more. That's 1991. And you see that across a period of 20 years or so, internet usage escalates. This is a logarithmic scale, so it's really multiplying 100-fold, not 1,000-fold by the end. And it seems to be that countries that have low public literacy in the traditional sense are not any less inclined towards increasing their internet usage. So all countries around the world, it seems, have rapidly increased internet access and internet usage by the population. So the internet is a hugely important variable in considering how it is that misinformation might spread. A slightly different take on this is to look at it by age. This is 2010 data from the United States. And if you compare different types of pursuits, the way people use their relaxation time, people under the age of 35 spend far more time using computers for leisure than they do relaxing and thinking or reading books or reading other things. People over that age, it's not the case at all that distinction is there. It's more or less an even spread. So what we can see, perhaps, if we were willing to kind of extrapolate wildly, is that in the future, we will have an increasing influence of internet-based information on public affairs, because the mass of the population, already quite a significant chunk of the population, are relying on the internet for relaxation. And they're browsing websites, and they're hearing things, and they're learning that way. And so as educators, obviously we're aware of digital literacy here, but as educators, we need to become digitally literate ourselves in order to populate that space and move our education in that direction. Internet is very popular, and people like social media in particular. As we've been seeing these last 2 days, you've probably seen this recently. It's Social Media Explained, but if you haven't, these are the distinctions between social media. So Twitter, if you're talking about a donut, this is what you have. I'm eating a donut. Facebook, I like donuts. Foursquare, this is where I eat donuts. Instagram, here's my vintage photo of a donut. YouTube, here I am eating a donut. LinkedIn, my skills include donut eating. Pinterest, here is a donut recipe. Last.fm, now listening to donuts. And Google+, I'm a Google employee who eats donuts. So there you have, in a short time, an entire summary of what you need to know about social media. So we'll move on. As educators, we're very familiar with Wikipedia. I think Wikipedia is worth a lot of consideration. It's very easy to dismiss Wikipedia. It's one of those sort of scapegoats. People say that Wikipedia is unreliable and so on, and it is, but it provides you with entry to the back end of things, so you can diagnose where the information has come from or where the misinformation has come from. And in that way, that mechanical structure is very useful to see and interpret. You can't do that with most newspaper articles, for example. So to see something on Wikipedia, you can gauge its provenance very easily. And most things, I think, are reliable on Wikipedia. Of course, some things aren't, and there are classic examples of this. I mean, the cartoon Archie's gang, they've been accused of all sorts of terrible things here. In science, DNA, if you just stare at that long enough, you'll see there's sort of an odd kind of comment on DNA itself in there. So yes, Wikipedia is unreliable. But if you don't like what you see, you can always change it and make it more reliable. And over time, you can understand where that information is coming from. If it's a popular form of peer review, and it might require some thought and reflection, but I think it's premature to dismiss Wikipedia. Just the way the internet works and the way people use the internet itself suggests that misinformation is not really being filtered out. You don't have to go as far as Google to discover that. So if you look at the autocomplete on Google, you don't have to go as far as Wikipedia to see that. If you look at the autocomplete on Google, you will see the types of things people want to find out more about. And so here's some examples. Now, the top one on that, can I get AIDS from swimming with black people, is a bit of a classic on the internet now. So quite a lot of those searches are actually for people looking up to see what's this about Google when you search for this term. But some of the other ones are not classics, but they're still very informative. This is what people want to know when they go to the internet. Can I get AIDS from a cat, for example, down the line there. That was from a year or two ago, and that's why the Winter Olympics thing is up in the top there. Just the other day, I did a couple more, because I thought, this isn't an unusual pursuit, but I thought it might be relevant to our conversation today. So when people are looking up things on evolution, Google now kind of only gives you 3 or 4 items to look at, but they're almost haiku-like in their kind of profundity. So you have, evolution is false, is a fact, is a lie, is evil. So this is what the types of things people are going to look for when they're looking for things about evolution. Psychology, I said, is my background. I really like what happens when you look at psychology is You basically... you really basically... What you have there, it's very insightful. It's the 3 types of psychologists. That's basically it. Okay. And seeing as I was on the internet, and as you do, I looked at this as well. And I thought this was actually quite neat when you actually get to the end of it. So science is, or sex is so overrated, so weird, so much better, and socially constructed. All right, okay. So people look at things on the internet, you get some insight. And you can sort of make it your business to go around correcting people. But that's quite a difficult thing to do single-handedly. I want to give you a short case study, just as one example that was mentioned yesterday, something that the internet did play a role in terms of mass transmission of misinformation. This relates to the widespread belief that vaccination is dangerous. It was alluded to yesterday, I think, by Adam Rutherford in the discussion after the talk, the particular concern about MMR vaccination and autism. Now, it has to be pointed out, and from a social scientist's perspective, it's of interest to know that these things have been around for as long as compulsory mass vaccination or mass vaccination programs have existed. And the current scare is always a function of current cultural concerns rather than actual observations of people getting sick after vaccination. But the particular one we were talking about yesterday related to a paper published in the Lancet journal in 1998 by lead author Andrew Wakefield, almost certainly personally responsible for everything in it, which was picked up as evidence. It was a study of 12 children who had autism symptoms who had recently been vaccinated against MMR, and it was interpreted in press conference land, really, as evidence that there was the vaccination had been leaking from where it should have gone. It's gone into the bowel and is causing autism. It went all over the world. People were concerned about this, although only in English-speaking countries, or primarily in English-speaking countries, which is an interesting thing if you imagine what that implies for the validity of the claim. In other countries, they have different concerns. Like in France, they're concerned that polio vaccination contributes to multiple sclerosis. So we don't have that concern. So there's interesting things that when they stop at the border, you can begin to draw conclusions about how really meritorious the claim is. But as we possibly know, it led to a downturn in the uptake of vaccination, which then led to an increase, a rapid increase in the number of cases of these illnesses, including rubella, which ironically is a risk factor. If a pregnant woman has rubella, it's a risk factor for autism in the child. So in an ironic turn, there was possibly more autism as well as more mumps and measles and rubella itself as a result of this scare. Without going into the details, because they're well reported elsewhere, it was originally thought that the paper was just weak, but now we've been fairly well convinced that the paper was actually fabricated in lots of ways, and the data in the paper, most critically, was fabricated. And it took an investigative journalist to discover this, who went as far as going to the people's houses, and it turned out that the 12 children and their parents were actually not the consecutive cases who arrived at the hospital by themselves, but were people in a group who had wanted to sue a drug company and had paid Wakefield £250,000 to help them, and he invented some data and put it into the paper. So it's not just a weak piece of research that's unconvincing, it's well established to be falsified data. And I'm not afraid to use that term. People aren't afraid to use that term anymore because it's well established. The General Medical Council went to town on Wakefield arising from this and other misdemeanours. Lots of false data in circulation, lots of insincere statements being made on grant applications, ethics applications and so on. And he was struck off the medical register and found guilty on several hundred counts of breaching the code of ethics and was basically run out of the country, you might think. But on the 28th of January, when he walked out of his GMC hearing, did people try to pelt him with eggs? Did someone try to kill him? No, he walked out to a crowd of supporters who continue to this day to be loyal to him and to now lump the GMC into the conspiracy to try to cause more autism in the world. And websites like this one, Age of Autism, say, can you tell me what's wrong with Wakefield's research? No, you can't. Why? Because there's no evidence he did anything wrong. And that's just a statement of non-fact, but far more people read Age of Autism and similar websites then read the medical journals or GMC reports. This is of interest perhaps in this sense. These are mass traffic websites, all of which have been accused of being anti-scientific. I just want to walk you through then what I do with my students in this regard. We can conclude there's a lot of mumbo-jumbo, woo, etc. in the world. It affects people's decisions, it affects the way we're governed, it affects choices made medically and in other contexts that are important. If you were a philosopher of science, you will already know that you can distinguish science from pseudoscience in various ways. And with undergraduates, you can more or less approach this by using a checklist methodology. So here are some differences in principle between science and pseudoscience concerning things like falsifiability, confirmation biases, parsimony, and so on. There are also differences in practice. Pseudoscience tends to use press conferences rather than medical journals, to keep data secret rather than publish it, and so forth. And if you then take a case study, you can sort of list off what features are present in the case study. So in this particular case study, you can ask students to generate some observations as to what is happening here that would fit the checklist to be a warning sign of pseudoscience. That's Jenny McCarthy, a celebrity in the US who is an anti-vaccinationist. So what we did, and what I've done with students over these last number of years, is run some courses on pseudoscience and on human values in science, and ask the students to generate case studies of their own. So they go find a media report like I did with a Daily Mail story, and then they critique it and see what kind of evidence of pseudoscience there is. I have a few of them linkable there, but you can find them on the web address there. Do we have time maybe to look at one? Shall I just pop one up anyway, see what happens? So here's a story about someone who saw Jesus Christ in the cliffs of Moher. And there's a summary. So this is the structure I gave them. So provide a summary of the story. Say why it's pseudo-news. So give some examples of kind of psychological principles like pareidolia and the Gestalt laws and so on. And then go through what features of pseudoscience are on show, and they have a lack of parsimony, appealing to the masses, lacks falsifiability, and then give the moral of the story. And about 70 or 80 students do this with 70 or 80 different news stories, and it's all up on this website so that people can attract comments and views from around the world. And I encourage you to have a look, because I think the students would really enjoy having more people look at these things. So there's a couple of other news stories, and they're all listed there nicely on the front page, so you can sort of browse and have a quick look at that. On a similar vein, there's some presentations on this particular website as well. It's a different course where people are asked to come up with some suggestions about how public policy might be informed by empirical evidence, and how you might sort of play that role. Okay. And this is a map of the different countries that have viewed these two websites since they were launched earlier this year. So the students not only are working in groups, not only are engaging in sort of a systematic epistemological analysis of news stories, not only are they engaging in writing about news and science, they're also posting a legacy of information online and existing in that space. Okay. And essentially, my point that I'm trying to convey is that, okay, there is misinformation. We are being swamped with mumbo-jumbo. It's part of the human condition, and it's entirely reasonable. People are trying to explore their boundaries and their surroundings and are being flooded with information in various ways. So naturally, the way to deal with that is not to try to correct each news story one by one, but try to equip our students and learners and one another with the literacy and scientific insights that they can actually deal with such claims when they're made, and educate others and be ambassadors for knowledge as the cases arise. And the online dimension to this is actually quite useful, because students can really immerse themselves. It's where they spend their time anyway. They can certainly encounter the pseudoscience, but they can also deal with it there in very effective and imaginative and memorable ways. So with that, I'll leave you there for today. Thank you very much.